Ano ay may Kealoha Ko and Velina Mai to the Honua Scholars Dialogue Series. This is our second session in 2024, and today we're going to learn about STEM pathways after a PhD from Dr. Chris Perez. Chris is a thermal design engineer for Apple working in their Silicon Engineering group. His work consists of designing cooling solutions and material stacks for the packaging surrounding Apple's microchips. He was a doctoral researcher working at the NanoHeat Laboratory at Stanford University and Sandia National Laboratories, where he developed measurement techniques for understanding energy transport in nanoscale materials and interfaces. Before this, Chris obtained a bachelor's degree in mechanical engineering from UCLA, where he worked on fungal biomaterials for sustainability. Chris, thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule to be here with us, assuming you are probably calling from the continent. So thanks for taking time out of your evening. We're so excited to learn from you. The floor is yours.
Oh, yeah, thanks, Courtney. Appreciate it. Can you guys hear me okay? I'm using a laptop that isn't mine.
Yep, you're
Okay, we're good.
good.
Yeah, so I do have some slides. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for having me here. I do have some slides. This is a short presentation. Yeah, yeah. Well, got it. Can you guys see these slides?
Yep, they're good.
Might take a while to upload. Okay, yeah, as Courtney mentioned, I'm Chris. I recently got my PhD maybe a year ago, year and a half ago. And now I'm in industry, and I'm gonna basically walk through what industry is like, and basically go through a little bit of the research I did and why I chose industry to begin with, which actually was not my first choice. So to get started, so this is kind of like a one slide about pretty much everything I did leading up to graduating. So as Courtney mentioned, PhD in mechanical engineering, also minor in electrical engineering, master's in mechanical engineering, all at Stanford, UCLA mechanical engineering. So very much an engineering uh, oriented person. I did go to community college, so I got a associate's in engineering as well. So generally, what I did is, if you can see on the top right, I sort of really worked with like measurement techniques, understanding like how energy transports in a very like small scale, so nanoscale, and I'll talk about what that means later on. But obviously, I didn't do it alone. I had a lot of advisors and mentors, as you can see down there. So from Stanford, my advisor Ken Goodson, Harry Pop. Media Shaggy, and then I did work in national labs with Suhas Kumar, Alec Talon, and Henrik Oldog. I did do some internships, mainly in undergrad, working at GE Aviation, Northrop Grumman. So these are all like kind of like defense contractors, which I thought I wanted to do, but I decided against. And as I mentioned, Sandia National Labs, working in their like materials physics group, essentially. So moving forward, so why I chose to do the PhD to begin with, I did go to undergrad in UCLA, and then I met my advisor. So this is Professor Laurent Pilon, and he taught a course in what was it? In thermodynamics, I think. Yeah, so that was thermodynamics. So that was my first kind of like introduction to sort of energy transport and all this, thermal stuff. And I really enjoyed it. I got a decent grade in his class, and he invited me to join his lab. And I did this research experience in the top middle picture there. That's me basically following this research experience as a summer thing. And basically, I really enjoyed it, and nobody else enjoyed it but me, apparently, in that cohort. And my friend was like, "How do you have the patience to do this?" So it really takes a particular kind of person to first do a PhD, right? But then my mentor on the right here, top right, Alex Teal, he basically, encouraged me some more. He encouraged me some more, and it's really slow. And basically, I was able to, do some research on the side apart from the regular studies I had to work on these really cool fungal materials. So basically, this is using fungus as a biomaterial, as a building material because it's so thermally insulating. So you could use it for like, to replace styrofoam easily. I also looked at a transparent glass using wood substrates. That was kind of interesting too. So I had this emphasis on sustainability and energy efficiency, and at the same time electronics, because you could use a lot of these materials in electronic packaging. Uh, so following this experiment, I decided to actually do a graduate degree, a PhD degree, and I was really interested in these uh, like devices, right? Like these microchips, and I looked at the history of them and basically looked at how uh, they're scaling. Basically, they're getting smaller and smaller. They're becoming cheaper and cheaper, and we're coming to a point where they're so small that they actually approach the size of a DNA strand. So that's about 2.5 millimeters or nanometers. And they're actually smaller than this now. So they're actually looking towards like 1 nanometer, which is insanely small. The point is, at some point, we can't physically make things smaller. So obviously, either these things are going to get more expensive or they're going to be way less efficient as they get smaller, right? And to me, being a, kind of an environmental sustainable person, I'm like, we can't have that because everybody uses these things. And if we all use them and they're so inefficient, then we're just going to be spending so much power like needlessly, right? So that's sort of what motivated me to look at these, small scale like electronic devices, basically. And the main problem with them, as I mentioned earlier, is that they're really power hungry, which means that they're going to get extremely hot, right? Because it's such a small area and you're dissipating so much power. So the main like bottleneck in devices essentially is how hot they get. And what ends up happening is that you can design the best thing that you like a great system. It's perfect in every way, but it's you have this thermal issue, and because of this thermal issue, you can't like achieve that great design that you want, or you can't really implement that feature that you want. So really, it's not only like bottlenecking the efficiency of our devices, but also the imagination, the creation, the innovation of our of our engineers, which is also kind of a secondary effect of this phenomenon, actually. Um, so during my PhD, I looked at basically what a future like microchip would look like. So here we have the different components of like a device. So we would have like optical input and output, some sort of passivation. Passivation just means like basically a material that makes sure that nothing is shorting in the device. You don't have any like electrical contact that you don't want. You'd have some memory component, you have some compute, some interconnects, and basically my PhD dealt with dealing with material systems relevant to this stack. So I looked at basically interconnect metals, I looked at passivation, and I looked at all these interface dense structures, and I basically looked at how thermal energy transports between like all of these different things. So the interfaces, the films themselves. So there's a lot of material science, a lot of instrumentation, and a lot of electrical engineering to understand, what are the figures of merit, and how do we engineer these materials to be better and more efficient? And we were able to get some good, publications and design work out of this too, sort of guide engineers in the field. It's kind of interesting. So that pretty much wraps up the PhD. I guess a little taste of what I did in the PhD. But to move on, once the PhD is over, it's kind of interesting how real everything gets. So basically, as a PhD, you can either go, in my opinion, three routes. You can go industry, academia, and research. And industry is the most common. So that's what people, usually do. They usually want to go to startups, big firms, nonprofits. But academia is the one I was actually kind of interested in. So I wanted to be a professor, and that in that bracket we have teacher, professor, instructor, and general educator. And that's sort of kind of the original reason people do PhDs, but now it's for all kinds of reasons. So. And then we have research. So this was a little less talked about, but you could go the national laboratory route. So you continue doing that research that you did during your PhD, but in a different capacity. So like in a large scale team, or working towards some sort of government initiative or private laboratory. Um, but for me, the main three things I was looking at post PhD was, how lucrative is is the job? Because I don't know, that's something that's important to me because not only am I trying to, do great things, but I'm also trying to get, compensated for it, right? Because I'm trying to build a life with, my family essentially. So that was a huge portion of it, and that's here. So that's one third of it basically. And another part of it was the research. I really enjoyed research. I would like to continue doing that. So that's why it was a big portion of what I wanted. out of a job, and freedom. And when I say freedom, I mean, not only, do I have time off, but also like, freedom to work on the things I want to work on, right? And typically with freedom, as you see this plot on the bottom here, so the more freedom you have, actually it should be opposite. That should be going downwards. But anyway, the more freedom you have, the less lucrative the job tends to be. And that's kind of unfortunate, because, usually the more lucrative something is, the less freedom you have, the less time you have to do anything else except that job. And that's not something I wanted. So that's why I decided to work at Apple. And I got a decent offer from them because I had some lab mates working there, and they basically said, "Oh, this place is great. Come over, you can help out." So Apple, as you all know, is basically a huge, consumer electronics provider. So they provide iPhones, Macs, iPads, and Apple Vision's coming up pretty soon too. And basically, what they do is, or what they did was, before they relied on, big foundries like Intel and all these companies to make their own silicon and design their own chips. But now they're doing all this stuff in-house, which is really interesting. So that's where, conveniently I joined and I was able to sort of help them out on this, how to design microchips for, energy efficiency and, thermally aware, like microchip stacks. So here's a little graphic of what like microchip packaging looks like. So you have like DRAMs and you have the MLB board and the actual, gray piece here, which is the chip itself. We call it the system on chip because it has so many things in it. It's a system and it's on a very small chip. And what I essentially do most of the time is run thermal simulations, and on the bottom left there are like kind of the temperature uh, maps that we would see in your average simulation. And we look at basically, where are things getting hot? Why are they getting hot? Can we, design it in such a way where the heat is dissipated more strategically? Can we, like, what kind of guard bands do we have so, people don't burn their hands or the battery lasts like only like an hour? So how do we avoid those situations? So that's sort of the kind of work I'm doing for Apple. And basically I kind of took a look at my day and like, okay, what am I doing like actually most of the day? And it's actually not as cool as you may think. So here's a pie chart of essentially like the typical day at Apple. And most of it is running simulations as in a huge portion of the gray, and organizing data. So most of the time I'm working on slides or like, plugging numbers and pressing run on a simulation, and that's not to, downplay simulations. They're very important. It's a very good skill to have, especially if you're in STEM, because, depending on what you put in, depending on your assumptions, like it can all go wrong, right? So you have to be really, it's an art to it, really. But I was more of an experimentalist and I'm kind of forced to do this work. So that's just my, my opinion of it. It's like, oh, it's just simulations. But those two, those two things sort of dictate most of my day. And next up is experiments. So I do experiments for Apple, and I can't really talk about those, but they're not that the experiments I did in my PhD are more scientifically, intriguing than the ones I'm doing now. But I do them, and then followed by meetings and R&D. So R&D is kind of my favorite thing, which is only like 5% of my day. Um, so my favorite thing is to develop, what I've been doing. Like, how do we like what's a crazy idea we can implement, or what's a crazy way we can do something that makes it more efficient? And maybe it's like it's high risk, but it's also high reward. So those are the sorts of things that excite me, and I'm kind of sad that it's only 5% of my day. But maybe I'm a year and a half in, and it's assumed that with time with the company, that slice that you like doing is larger and larger. So I'm really hopeful for that. And on the left there are some pros and cons of this kind of work, this kind of job. And the pros, as I mentioned, is very financially advantageous compared to other jobs. So your compensation package as a whole is much larger, even double than of what an academic job would have. Intellectually stimulating. So I'm doing a lot of things now that I would never have done in my PhD, such as like manufacturing something. So I'm actually more involved in the manufacturing space now. So that's something I don't have too much experience with, but I'm able to get that experience, through this job. The hybrid work model is nice, so I can work remote. Right now I'm actually taking a remote week, so I'm in Pennsylvania, like, going to a wedding, but I can like take this week off work remote, and do it that way, which is kind of nice. And there's also many benefits, working at a company like big company like Apple. So we have, company shuttles, so you can take those, not have to waste any gas, can work on the bus or on the shuttle. Subsidized food is very cheap at cafes and discounts on like a lot of different services. There's a whole like list of them, which is crazy. But the cons are, as I mentioned, we're not truly free, right? So we always have this high-paced environment where things are due and we kind of have to do things for people, a lot of requests that, it's all kind of tedious and it takes a lot of your day, as I mentioned. The working hours are long, oftentimes I work, more than 8 hours a day, like 10 to 12, but a lot of that is self-imposed because I want to do good work. And to me, good work means, perfecting everything. That's just my personality. It might not be, the same for other people, but I do find myself working, more time, but definitely not compared to, your when I did what I did during my PhD. Because during my PhD, I worked like a lot. So this is not, I feel this is like an upgrade essentially. And vacation, obviously, I can't just leave like I used to in the PhD. I have to basically ask permission all the time, right? So I have to, talk to my manager and be like, can I leave this week? Can I do this? Can I do that? So it's kind of not, it's not great. Um, and a big thing that, many of you may have or may encounter is that you might feel like you're not having a real impact on people's lives. So the part of the reason why we all do a PhD is we want to basically have, making the world a better place. But working at a big company, you might feel like that's so far, like there's so many people in between you and the end user that you feel like you're not really directly making an impact on someone's life, right? Um, so that's why, you might feel like after a while, like, what am I doing here? Like, why am I doing this? Um, but yeah, I mean, if you can get over that feeling and if you can sort of connect the dots as to like, oh, what I'm doing now will, impact a person's device, which will impact their productivity, and you can like kind of justify it that way if you like. But for a lot of people, that's a problem. And yeah, that's everything I had for now. And I don't know if there's like a Q&A or something, but I'd be glad to answer any questions.
Nice. Thank you, Chris. Oh yeah. Go ahead.
No, no, I didn't say anything. I was just laughing.
Oh, cool. Yeah, so we have time for Q&A. We do have three winners for the gift cards, and I'll put it in after this first question. But I had a question. What software do you use for the simulations? And are you doing that on a Windows or an Apple computer?
Oh God, it's hilarious. Yeah, so the software we typically use are like Ansys suite. So if you're familiar with Ansys, like they have a suite of, all these different, simulation softwares. It's actually kind of interesting because for us, for like the thermal team, we use Ansys, but there's other teams like mechanical team and optics teams that use like COMSOL. So there's different kinds of software depending on your team. But my team in particular uses Ansys. And oh, one second. Yeah, sorry about that. But for the question regarding like if we use Apple product, um, so for day to day we use Apple stuff, but actually simulation wise we do use Windows because it just works better with the with the software. So yeah.
Yeah, I was just thinking all the simulation stuff. I feel like a lot of it is on Windows, so just curious. Oh, there's a few
Oh
more
yeah, definitely.
questions in the chat. Um, so yeah, how does the team decide which software to use?
Yeah, so honestly, it depends on the people, like the most senior people in the team and what they're comfortable with. Like, uh, for example, like for coding, for like simple coding, a lot of people in my team are like comfortable with MATLAB, but a lot of us are like, oh, why don't we just Python code it or like use another code? But like, there's a lot of resistance to to that because basically the senior people are the people that like really make the decisions, and if we go against them, it's like like, okay, you can do whatever you want, but as it ends up being in a format they can use, so it ends up being like less. It's easier just to go through the learning curve and learn their software instead of like trying to implement something else. Yeah.
Thank you. Oh, plenty of questions in the chat. Keep them coming. So Yavo, what is your future plan?
Fun. Oh God. Yeah, I sort of went into this role. Honestly, I treated this as a postdoc because I'm like, oh, I can get some simulation skills. But I am enjoying it, and I am getting more freedom as time passes, right? I'm becoming like the owner of things now, and I'm like have more responsibility, which is kind of, making me stay there a little more. But I guess my future plan is to, see if I can integrate, if I can I really like the lab atmosphere, and I'd really like to, start that up in my team in particular, because I know there are labs at Apple, but they're very secretive, so you can't just like apply to one. So I'd rather just like start one with my group and see, how far we can take it. Yeah.
That's a really interesting structure. I didn't know about that. That's pretty cool. Um, and then do you see yourself still working at Apple in the next decade?
Oh man. Yeah. I mean, it's very fast paced, and I think the average like tenure at Apple is like 2 years. So I'm coming up on it actually. Um, yeah, I think they do a really good job at like kind of making you stay there. Because like they grant you stock in the company, and it only vests like, every so often. So the constant like dialogue in your head is like, oh, I only need to stay like until the next stock vests. But then they give you more, and you're like, oh God, I need to stay until that. So this constant cycle. So yeah, I would say like 10 years is kind of stretching it. Definitely within the next five, I'd say, but 10 years I'd like to work somewhere more academic, hopefully. Yeah. But that's just
Do
me.
you,
I mean, a lot of people
yeah,
would keep doing what they, yeah.
nice. Do you have any advice for people like who are maybe undergraduates, like deciding if they should go to grad school or not, and like how these different paths relate to kind of the next thing they do after college?
Uh, yeah, I guess it depends. I can only speak for like the tech sector, but I would definitely encourage them to do grad school, whether it be for a master's or a PhD. Maybe not a PhD because honestly, like, I don't know. I think like the kind of work I'm doing now does not require a PhD. But like it was still a requisite or a prerequisite because it's somehow a filter for like, I don't know, for being like competent, but I don't think that's the case. But I guess like I would definitely go with the master's because it does kind of like focus your degree to the point where like all these recruiters will actually consider you. Because I know like at least at Apple, like it's very, very difficult for someone with a bachelor's to like join. It's easier for someone with a master's to join because it's like it's kind of shows that you've sharpened up your skills to a certain like field, and you maybe have worked on a project before, and that I feel like that's harder to do while you're a bachelor's. Yeah. But I would definitely, at least encourage people to do the master's.
Nice. And then we have one more question in the chat from Kavena. Um, so yeah, why not defense and content or job
Oh yeah.
opportunities?
Yeah, I think like well defense so defense is actually kind of interesting because defense is like some of the chillest work you'll ever have because like they have even though they technically have like to work on Friday, nobody shows up on like it's so chill because like everybody's kind of older and like doesn't really care. So I think like if anything, the work-life balance of the defense job is like really nice. So it wasn't really the work. It was more of like you mentioned, like the content. I just didn't feel like it aligned with what I wanted to do or what I wanted to bring in the world, I guess. Um, so I just decided against it. I mean, it was technically really interesting, and as I mentioned, work-life balance was great, but just the content was off. Yeah.
Nice. Wow. Thank you again. I think, does anyone have any more questions? I think we're good. But yeah, this was a really great talk. We're on our 30-minute mark. We're trying to keep these short and sweet. But hopefully, everyone who attended, you got a little vignette about Chris's experience and what it's like with this academic industry pathway.